Book 6. And so, Glaucon, I said, through a somewhat lengthy argument, who the philosophers are and who the non-philosophers has, with considerable effort, somehow been brought to light. Perhaps, he said, that's because it could not easily have been done through a short one. It doesn't look like it, I said. Still, in my opinion at least, it would have been better done if this were the only question that had to be treated. And there weren't many things left to treat for one who was going to see what the difference is between the just life and the unjust one. What's after this for us, he said. What else but what's next, I said. Since philosophers are those who are able to grasp what is always the same in all respects, while those who are not able to do so, but wander among what is many and varies in all ways are not philosophers, which should be the leaders of a city? How should we put it so as to speak sensibly, he said. Those who look as if they're capable of guarding the laws and practices of cities should be established as guardians. Right, he said. But is it plain, I said, whether it's a blind guardian or a sharp-sighted one, who ought to keep watch over anything? Of course it's plain, he said. Well, does there seem to be any difference, then, between blind men and those men who are really deprived of the knowledge of what each thing is, those who have no clear pattern in the soul, and are hence unable, after looking off as painters do, toward what is truest, and ever referring to it and contemplating it as precisely as possible, to give laws about what is fine, just, and good, if any need to be given, and as guardians to preserve those that are already established? No, by Zeus, he said, there isn't much difference. Shall we set these men up as guardians rather than those who not only know what each thing is, but also don't lack experience, or fall short of the others in any other part of virtue? It would be strange to choose others, he said, if, that is, these men don't lack the rest, for the very thing in which they would have the advantage is just about the most important. Then shouldn't we say how the same men will be able to possess these two distinct sets of qualities? Most certainly. Well then, as we were saying at the beginning of this argument, first their nature must be thoroughly understood. And I suppose if we should come to an adequate agreement about that, we'll also agree that the same men will be able to possess both, and that there should be no other leaders of cities than these. How shall we do it? About philosophic natures, let's agree that they are always in love with that learning which discloses to them something of the being that is always, and does not wander about, driven by generation and decay. Yes, let's agree to that. And further, I said, that just like the lovers of honor and the erotic men we described before, they love all of it and don't willingly let any part go, whether smaller or bigger, more honorable or more contemptible. What you say is right, he said. Well, next consider whether it is necessary, in addition, that those who are going to be such as we were saying, have this further characteristic in their nature. What? No taste for falsehood. That is, they are completely unwilling to admit what's false, but hate it, while cherishing the truth. It's likely, he said. It's not only likely, my friend, but also entirely necessary that a man who is by nature erotically disposed toward someone care for everything related and akin to his boy. Right, he said. Now, could you find anything more akin to wisdom than truth? Of course not, he said. Now, is it possible that the same nature be both a lover of wisdom and a lover of falsehood? In no way. Therefore, the man who is really a lover of learning must from youth on strive as intensely as possible for every kind of truth. Entirely so. But further, we surely know that when someone's desires incline strongly to some one thing, they are therefore weaker with respect to the rest, like a stream that has been channeled off in that other direction. Of course. So, when in someone they have flowed toward learning and all that's like it, I suppose they would be concerned with the pleasure of the soul itself with respect to itself, and would forsake those pleasures that come through the body, if he isn't a counterfeit but a true philosopher. That is most necessary. Such a man is, further, moderate, and in no way a lover of money. Money and the great expense that accompanies it are pursued for the sake of things that any other man, rather than this one, is likely to take seriously. That's so? And you too must of course also consider something else when you're going to judge whether a man is philosophic or not. What? You mustn't let its partaking in illiberality get by you unnoticed. For petty speech is of course most opposite to a soul that is always going to reach out for the whole and for everything divine and human. Very true, he said. To an understanding endowed with magnificence, and the contemplation of all time and all being. Do you think it possible that human life seem anything great? Impossible, he said. Won't such a man also believe that death is not something terrible? Not in the least. So, a cowardly and illiberal nature would not, as it seems, participate in true philosophy. Not in my opinion. What then? Is there any way in which the orderly man, who isn't a lover of money or illiberal or a boaster or a coward, could become a hard bargainer or unjust? There isn't. And further, when you are considering whether a soul is philosophic or not, you'll also take into consideration whether, from youth on, it is both just and tame or hard to be a partner with and savage. Most certainly. And you won't leave this out either, I suppose. What? Whether he learns well or with difficulty? Or do you ever expect anyone would care sufficiently for a thing that, when he does it, he does painfully, accomplishing little with much effort? That could not be. And what if he were able to preserve nothing of what he learns, being full of forgetfulness? Would it be possible he be not empty of knowledge? Of course not. So, toiling without profit, don't you suppose he'll finally be compelled to hate both himself and an activity of this sort? Of course. Let us never, then, admit a forgetful soul into the ranks of those that are adequately philosophic. In our search, let us rather demand a soul with a memory. Most certainly. Further, we would deny that what has an unmusical and graceless nature is drawn in any direction other than that of want of measure. Of course. Do you believe that truth is related to want of measure, or to measure? To measure. Then, besides the other things, let us seek for an understanding endowed by nature with measure and charm, one whose nature grows by itself in such a way as to make it easily led to the idea of each thing that is. Of course. What then? Have we, in your opinion, gone through particular qualities that are in any way unnecessary and inconsequent to one another in a soul that is going to partake adequately and perfectly in what is? They are, he said, certainly most necessary. Is there any way, then, in which you could blame a practice like this that a man could never adequately pursue if he were not by nature a rememberer, a good learner, magnificent, charming, and a friend and kinsman of truth, justice, courage, and moderation? Not even Momus, he said, could blame a practice like that. When such men, I said, are perfected by education and age, wouldn't you turn the city over to them alone? And Adeimantus said, Socrates, no one could contradict you in this. But here is how those who hear what you now say are affected on each occasion. They believe that because of inexperience at questioning and answering, they are at each question misled a little by the argument, and when the littles are collected at the end of the arguments, the slip turns out to be great and contrary to the first assertions. And just as those who aren't clever at playing draughts are finally checked by those who are and don't know where to move, so they too are finally checked by this other kind of draughts, played not with counters but speeches, and don't know what to say. However, the truth isn't in any way affected by this. In saying this, I look to the present case. Now someone might say that in speech he can't contradict you at each particular thing asked, but indeed he sees that of all those who start out on philosophy, not those who take it up for the sake of getting educated when they are young and then drop it, but those who linger in it for a longer time, most become quite queer, not to say completely vicious, while the ones who seem perfectly decent do nevertheless suffer at least one consequence of the practice you are praising. They become useless to the cities. And when I heard this, I said, "Do you suppose that the men who say this are lying?" "I don't know," he said, "but I should gladly hear your opinion." "You would hear that it looks to me as if they were speaking the truth." "Then how," he said, "can it be good to say that the cities will have no rest from evils before the philosophers, whom we agree to be useless to the cities, rule in them?" "The question you are asking," I said, "needs an answer given through an image." "And you in particular," he said, "I suppose, aren't used to speaking through images." "All right," I said. "Are you making fun of me after having involved me in an argument so hard to prove? At all events, listen to the image so you may see still more how greedy I am for images. So hard is the condition suffered by the most decent men with respect to the cities that there is no single other condition like it. But I must make my image and apology on their behalf by bringing it together from many sources, as the painters paint goat stags and such things, by making mixtures. Conceive something of this kind happening either on many ships or one. Though the ship owner surpasses everyone on board in height and strength, he is rather deaf and likewise somewhat short-sighted, and his knowledge of seamanship is pretty much on the same level. The sailors are quarreling with one another about the piloting, each supposing he ought to pilot, although he has never learned the art and can't produce his teacher or prove there was a time when he was learning it. Besides this, they claim it isn't even teachable, and are ready to cut to pieces the man who says it is teachable. And they are always crowded around the ship owner himself, begging and doing everything so that he'll turn the rudder over to them. And sometimes, if they fail at persuasion and other men succeed at it, they either kill the others or throw them out of the ship. Enchaining the noble ship owner with mandrake, drink, or something else, they rule the ship. Using what's in it, and drinking and feasting, they sail as such men would be thought likely to sail. Besides this, they praise and call a skilled sailor, pilot, and knower of the ship's business, the man who is clever at figuring out how they will get the rule, either by persuading or by forcing the ship owner, while the man who is not of this sort they blame as useless. They don't know that for the true pilot, it is necessary to pay careful attention to year, seasons, heaven, stars, winds, and everything that's proper to the art, if he is really going to be skilled at ruling a ship. And they don't suppose it's possible to acquire the art and practice of how one can get hold of the helm whether the others wish it or not, and at the same time to acquire the pilot's skill. So with such things happening on the ships, don't you believe that the true pilot will really be called a stargazer, a prater, and useless to them by those who sail on ships run like this? Indeed he will, said Adeimantus. Now, I said, I don't suppose you need to scrutinize the image to see that it resembles the cities in their disposition toward the true philosophers, but you understand what I mean. Indeed I do, he said. First of all, then, teach the image to that man who wonders at the philosophers not being honored in the cities, and try to persuade him that it would be far more to be wondered at if they were honored. I shall teach him, he said. And further, that you are telling the truth in saying that the most decent of those in philosophy are useless to the many. However, bid him blame their uselessness on those who don't use them, and not on the decent men. For it's not natural that a pilot beg sailors to be ruled by him, nor that the wise go to the doors of the rich. The man who invented that subtlety lied. The truth, naturally, is that it is necessary for a man who is sick, whether rich or poor, to go to the doors of doctors, and every man who needs to be ruled to the doors of the man who is able to rule. Not for the ruler who is truly of any use to beg the ruled to be ruled. You'll make no mistake in imagining the statesmen now ruling to be the sailors we were just now speaking of, and those who are said by them to be useless and gossipers about what's above to be the true pilots. Quite right, he said. Well, then, on this basis, and under these conditions, it's not easy for the best pursuit to enjoy a good reputation with those who practice the opposite. But by far the greatest and most powerful slander comes to philosophy from those who claim to practice such things, those about whom you say philosophy's accuser asserts that, Most of those who go to it are completely vicious, and the most decent useless. And I admitted that what you say is true. Isn't that so? Yes. Haven't we gone through the cause of the uselessness of the decent ones? Yes, indeed. Do you want us next to go through the necessity of the viciousness of the many? And to try to show, if we are able, that philosophy isn't to blame for that? Most certainly. Then let us begin our listening and speaking by reminding ourselves of the point at which we started our description, of the kind of nature with which the man who is to be a gentleman is necessarily endowed. First, if it's present to your mind, truth guided him, and he had to pursue it entirely and in every way, or else be a boaster who in no way partakes of true philosophy. Yes, that was said. Now, isn't this one point quite contrary to the opinions currently held about him? Very much so, he said. So then, won't we make a sensible apology in saying that it is the nature of the real lover of learning to strive for what is, and he does not tarry by each of the many things opined to be, but goes forward, and does not lose the keenness of his passionate love, nor cease from it before he grasps the nature itself of each thing, which is with the part of the soul fit to grasp a thing of that sort, and it is the part akin to it that is fit. And once near it, and coupled with what really is, having begotten intelligence and truth, he knows and lives truly, is nourished, and so ceases from his labor pains, but not before. Nothing, he said, could be more sensible. What then? Will this man have any part in caring for falsehood? Or, all to the contrary, will he hate it? He'll hate it, he said. If truth led the way, we wouldn't, I suppose, ever assert a chorus of evils could follow it. Of course not. But a healthy and just disposition, which is also accompanied by moderation. Right, he said. Why, then, must I also force the rest of the philosophic nature's chorus into order all over again from the beginning? You surely remember that, appropriate to these, courage, magnificence, facility at learning, and memory went along with them. And you objected, saying that everyone would be forced to agree to what we are saying. But if they let the arguments go and looked to the men themselves whom the argument concerns, they would say they see that some of them are useless, and the many bad, possessing vice entire. In considering the cause of the slander, we've come now to this point. Why are the many bad? And it's for just this reason that we brought up the nature of the true philosophers again, and defined what it necessarily is. That's so, he said. Then we must, I said, look at the corruptions of this nature, and see how it is destroyed in many, while a small number escape, just those whom they call not vicious, but useless. And after that, in turn, we must look at the natures of the souls that imitate the philosophic nature, and set themselves up in its practice, and see what sort they are, who approach a practice that is of no value for them, and beyond them, and who often strike false notes, thereby attaching to philosophy, everywhere and among all men, a reputation such as you say. What corruptions do you mean? He said. I shall try, I said, if I am able, to go through them for you. Now I suppose everybody will agree with us about this. Such a nature, possessing everything we prescribed just now for the man who is going to become a perfect philosopher. Such natures are few and born only rarely among human beings. Or don't you suppose so? Indeed, I do. Now, consider how many great sources of ruin there are for these few. Just what are they? What is most surprising of all to hear is that each of the elements we praised in that nature has a part in destroying the soul that has them, and tearing it away from philosophy. I mean courage, moderation, and everything we went through. Yes, he said, that is strange to hear. And what's more, I said, besides these, all the things said to be goods corrupt it and tear it away. Beauty, wealth, strength of body, relatives who are powerful in a city, and everything akin to these. You see the type of thing I mean? I do, he said, and I would gladly learn more precisely what you mean. Well then, I said, grasp it correctly as a whole, and it will look perfectly plain to you, and what was said about them before won't seem strange. What do you bid me do? He said. Concerning every seed or thing that grows, whether from the earth or animals, I said, we know that the more vigorous it is, the more it is deficient in its own properties when it doesn't get the food, climate, or place suitable to it. For surely bad is more opposed to good than to not good. Of course. So I suppose it is reasonable that the best nature comes off worse than an ordinary one from an inappropriate rearing. Yes, it is. Won't we say for souls, too, Adeimantus, I said, that similarly, those with the best natures become exceptionally bad when they get bad instruction? Or do you suppose an ordinary nature is the source of great injustices and unmixed villainy? Don't you suppose, rather, that it's a lusty one corrupted by its rearing, while a weak nature will never be the cause of great things, either good or bad? Yes, he said, that's the case. Well then, I suppose that if the nature we set down for the philosopher chances on a suitable course of learning, it will necessarily grow and come to every kind of virtue. But if it isn't sown, planted, and nourished in what's suitable, it will come to all the opposite, unless one of the gods chances to assist it. Or do you too believe, as do the many, that certain young men are corrupted by sophists, and that there are certain sophists who in a private capacity corrupt to an extent worth mentioning? Isn't it rather the very men who say this who are the biggest sophists, who educate most perfectly, and who turn out young and old, men and women, just the way they want them to be? But when do they do that? He said. When, I said, many gathered together sit down in assemblies, courts, theaters, army camps, or any other common meeting of a multitude, and with a great deal of uproar, blame some of the things said or done, and praise others, both in excess, shouting and clapping. And besides, the rocks and the very place surrounding them echo and redouble the uproar of blame and praise. Now, in such circumstances, as the saying goes, what do you suppose is the state of the young man's heart? Or what kind of private education will hold out for him, and not be swept away by such blame and praise, and go, borne by the flood, wherever it tends, so that he'll say the same things are noble and base as they do? Practice what they practice, and be such as they are. The necessity is great, Socrates, he said. And yet, I said, we still haven't mentioned the greatest necessity. What? He said. What these educators and sophists inflict indeed when they fail to persuade in speech. Or don't you know that they punish the man who's not persuaded with dishonor, fines, and death? Yes, he said, they punish very severely. So, what other sophist or what sort of private speeches do you suppose will go counter to these and prevail? I don't suppose any will, he said. No, I said, but even the attempt is a great folly. For a character receiving an education contrary to theirs does not, has not, and will not become differently disposed toward virtue. A human character that is, my comrade, for the divine, according to the proverb. Let's make an exception to the argument. You should be well aware that if anything should be saved and become such as it ought to be in regimes in this kind of condition, it won't be bad if you say that a God's dispensation saved it. I am of no other opinion, he said. Well then, I said, besides that one, be of this opinion too. What? That each of the private wage earners whom these men call sophists, and believe to be their rivals in art, educates in nothing other than these convictions of the many, which they opine when they are gathered together, and he calls this wisdom. It is just like the case of a man who learns by heart the angers and desires of a great strong beast he is rearing, how it should be approached, and how taken hold of, when, and as a result of what, it becomes most difficult or most gentle, and particularly under what conditions it is accustomed to utter its several sounds, and in turn, what sort of sounds uttered by another make it tame and angry. When he has learned all this from associating and spending time with the beast, he calls it wisdom, and organizing it as an art, turns to teaching. Knowing nothing in truth about which of these convictions and desires is noble, or base, or good, or evil, or just, or unjust. He applies all these names following the great animal's opinions, calling what delights it good and what vexes it bad. He has no other argument about them, but calls the necessary just and noble, neither having seen nor being able to show someone else how much the nature of the necessary and the good really differ. Now, in your opinion, wouldn't such a man, in the name of Zeus, be out of place as an educator? Yes, he said, in my opinion, he would indeed. So, does this man seem any different from the man who believes it is wisdom to have figured out the anger and pleasures, whether in painting, music, or particularly in politics, of the multifarious many who assemble? However a man associates with them, whether he makes a display of poetry or any other product of craft, or any service to the city, making the many his masters beyond what is necessary, the so-called necessity of Diomede, will compel him to produce the things these men praise. But that those things are in truth good and noble. Have you up to now ever heard anyone presenting an argument for this that isn't ridiculous? No, he said, nor do I suppose I shall hear one. Well then, keep all this in mind and recall this question. Can a multitude accept or believe that the fair itself, rather than the many fair things, or that anything itself is, rather than the many particular things? Not in the least, he said. Then it's impossible, I said, that a multitude be philosophic. Yes, it is impossible. And so those who do philosophize are necessarily blamed by them. Necessarily? As well as by all those private men who consort with the mob and desire to please it. Plainly. So, on this basis, what salvation do you see for a philosophic nature so that it will remain in its practice and reach its end? Think it over on the basis of what went before. We did agree that facility at learning, memory, courage, and magnificence belong to this nature. Yes. Won't such a one be first among all in everything, straight from the beginning, especially if his body naturally matches his soul? Of course he will, he said. Then I suppose kinsmen and fellow citizens will surely want to make use of him, when he is older, for their own affairs. Of course. They will, therefore, lie at his feet begging and honoring him, taking possession of and flattering beforehand the power that is going to be his. At least, he said, that's what usually happens. What do you suppose, I said, such a young man will do in such circumstances, especially if he chances to be from a big city, is rich and noble in it, and is, further, good-looking and tall? Won't he be overflowing with unbounded hope, believing he will be competent to mind the business of both Greeks and barbarians, and won't he, as a result, exalt himself to the heights, mindlessly full of pretension and empty conceit? Indeed he will, he said. Now, if someone were gently to approach the young man in this condition and tell him the truth, that he has no intelligence in him, although he needs it, and that it's not to be acquired except by slaving for its acquisition, do you think it will be easy for him to hear through a wall of so many evils? Far from it, he said. But if, I said, thanks to his good nature and his kinship to such speeches, one young man were to apprehend something and be turned and drawn toward philosophy, what do we suppose those will do who believe they are losing his use and comradeship? Is there any deed they won't do, or any word they won't say concerning him, so that he won't be persuaded, and concerning the man who's doing the persuading, so that he won't be able to persuade? And won't they organize private plots and public trials? It's very necessary, he said. Is it possible that such a man will philosophize? Not at all. Do you see, I said, it wasn't bad when we said that the very elements of the philosophic nature, when they get a bad rearing, are, after all, in a way the cause of its being exiled from the practice, and so are the so-called goods, wealth, and all equipment of the sort. No, it wasn't, he said. What was said is right. "Then, you surprising man," I said, "such is the extent and character of this destruction and corruption of the best nature with respect to the best pursuit." And such a nature is a rare occurrence in any event, we say. And particularly from these men come those who do the greatest harm to cities and private men, as well as those who do the good, if they chance to be drawn in this direction. No little nature ever does anything great, either to private man or city. "Very true," he said. "So these men, for whom philosophy is most suitable, go thus into exile and leave her abandoned and unconsummated. They themselves live a life that isn't suitable or true, while after them other unworthy men came to her, like an orphan bereft of relatives, and disgrace her. These are the ones who attach to her reproaches, such as even you say are alleged by the men who reproach her, namely, that of those who have intercourse with her. Some are worthless, and the many worthy of many bad things." "Yes," he said, "that is what is said." "And what is said is fitting," I said. "For other mannikins see that this place has become empty, although full of fine names and pretensions, and just like those who run away from prisons to temples, these men too are overjoyed to leap out of the arts into philosophy, those who happen to be subtlest in their little art. For although philosophy is faring thus, it still retains a more magnificent station in comparison with the other arts at least. Aiming at this, many men with imperfect natures, just as their bodies are mutilated by the arts and crafts, so too their souls are doubled up and spoiled as a result of being in mechanical occupations. Or isn't that necessary?" "Quite so," he said. "Do you suppose," I said, "that they are any different to see than a little bald-headed worker in bronze who has gotten some silver, and newly released from bonds, just washed in a bathhouse, wearing a new-made cloak, and got up like a bridegroom, is about to marry his master's daughter because he's poor and destitute? Hardly at all different," he said. "What sort of things are such men likely to beget? Aren't they bastard and ordinary?" "Quite necessarily." "And what about this? When men unworthy of education come near her and keep her company in an unworthy way, what sort of notions and opinions will we say they beget? Won't they be truly fit to be called sophisms, connected with nothing genuine or worthy of true prudence?" "That's entirely certain," he said. "Then it's a very small group, Adeimantus," I said, "which remains to keep company with philosophy in a way that's worthy. Perhaps either a noble and well-reared disposition, held in check by exile, remains by her side consistent with nature for want of corruptors, or when a great soul grows up in a little city, despises the business of the city and looks out beyond, and perhaps a very few men from another art who justly despise it because they have good natures, might come to her, and the bridle of our comrade Theages might be such as to restrain him. For in Theages' case, all the other conditions for an exile from philosophy were present, but the sickliness of his body, shutting him out of politics, restrains him. My case, the demonic sign, isn't worth mentioning, for it has perhaps occurred in some one other man, or no other before. Now, the men who have become members of the small band have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession it is. At the same time, they have seen sufficiently the madness of the many, and that no one who minds the business of the cities does virtually anything sound, and that there is no ally with whom one could go to the aid of justice and be preserved. Rather, just like a human being who has fallen in with wild beasts, and is neither willing to join them in doing injustice, nor sufficient as one man to resist all the savage animals, one would perish before he has been of any use to city or friends, and be of no profit to himself or others. Taking all this into the calculation, he keeps quiet and minds his own business, as a man in a storm, when dust and rain are blown about by the wind, stands aside under a little wall. Seeing others filled full of lawlessness, he is content if somehow he himself can live his life here, pure of injustice and unholy deeds, and take his leave from it graciously and cheerfully with fair hope. Well, he said, he would leave having accomplished not the least of things. But not the greatest either, I said, if he didn't chance upon a suitable regime. For in a suitable one, he himself will grow more and save the common things along with the private. Now the reasons why philosophy is slandered, and that it isn't just that it be, have, in my opinion, been sensibly stated, unless you still have something else to say. I have nothing further to say about this, he said. But which of the current regimes do you say is suitable for it? None at all, I said. But this is the very charge I'm bringing. Not one city today is in a condition worthy of the philosophic nature, and this is why it is twisted and changed, just as a foreign seed sown in alien ground is likely to be overcome and fade away into the native stock. So too this class does not at present maintain its own power, but falls away into an alien disposition. But if it ever takes hold in the best regime, just as it is itself best, then it will make plain that it really is divine as we agreed it is, and that the rest are human, both in terms of their natures and their practices. Of course, it's plain that next you'll ask what this regime is. You've not got it, he said. That's not what I was going to ask, but whether it is the same one we described in founding the city or another. It is the same in the other respects, I said, and in this very one too, which was stressed in connection with it, that there would always have to be present in the city something possessing the same understanding of the regime as you, the lawgiver, had when you were setting down the laws. Yes, he said, that point was made. But it wasn't made sufficiently plain, I said, from fear of what you people with your insistence have made plain, that its demonstration would be long and hard. And now what's left is by no means the easiest to go through. What is it? How a city can take philosophy in hand without being destroyed. For surely all great things carry with them the risk of a fall, and really, as the saying goes, fine things are hard. All the same, he said, let the proof get its completion by clearing this up. It won't be hindered by a lack of willingness, but if by anything, by a lack of capacity, I said. You'll be on hand to see my eagerness at least. Consider how eagerly and recklessly I am going to say now that the way a city takes up this practice should be just the opposite of what is done nowadays. How? Nowadays, I said, those who take it up at all are lads fresh from childhood. In the interval before running a household and making money, they approach its hardest part and then leave, those, that is, who are fancied to be complete philosophers. I mean by the hardest part that which has to do with speeches. In later life, if others are doing this and they are invited, they believe it's a great thing if they are willing to be listeners, thinking it ought to be done as a hobby. Toward old age, except, of course, for a certain few, they are far more extinguished than Heraclitus' sun, inasmuch as they are not rekindled again. How ought it to be? He said. Entirely opposite. When they are youths and boys, they ought to take up an education and philosophy suitable for youths, and take very good care of their bodies at the time when they are growing and blooming into manhood, thus securing a helper for philosophy. And as they advance in age to the time when the soul begins to reach maturity, it ought to be subjected to a more intense gymnastic. And when strength begins to fail, and they are beyond political and military duties, at this time they ought to be let loose to graze and do nothing else, except as a spare time occupation. Those who are going to live happily, and when they die, crown the life they have lived with a suitable lot in that other place. In my opinion, you truly are speaking eagerly, Socrates, he said. However, I suppose that the many among the hearers are even more eager to oppose you and won't be persuaded at all, beginning with Thrasymachus. Don't make a quarrel between Thrasymachus and me when we've just become friends. Though we weren't even enemies before, I said. We'll not give up our efforts before we either persuade him and the others, or give them some help in preparation for that other life when, born again, they meet with such arguments. That's a short time you are speaking about, he said. No time at all, I said, if you compare it to the whole. However, it's no wonder that the many are not persuaded by these speeches, for they never saw any existing thing that matches the present speech. Far rather, they have seen such phrases purposely, balanced with one another, not falling together spontaneously as they are now. But as for a man who to the limit of the possible is perfectly likened to and balanced with virtue, in deed and speech, and holds power in a city fit for him, they have never seen one or more. Or do you suppose so? No, I don't at all. Nor, you blessed man, have they given an adequate hearing to fair and free speeches of the sort, that strain with every nerve in quest of the truth, for the sake of knowing, and that nod a distant greeting to the subtleties and contentious quibbles, that strain toward nothing but opinion and contention, in trials as well as in private groups. No, they haven't, he said. Well, it was on account of this, I said, foreseeing it then, that we were frightened. But, all the same, compelled by the truth, we said that neither city nor regime will ever become perfect, nor yet will a man become perfect in the same way either, before some necessity chances to constrain those few philosophers who aren't vicious, those now called useless, to take charge of a city, whether they want to or not, and the city to obey, or a true erotic passion, for true philosophy flows from some divine inspiration, into the sons of those who hold power or the office of king, or into the fathers themselves. I deny that there is any reason why either or both of these things is impossible. If that were the case, we would justly be laughed at for uselessly saying things that are like prayers. Or isn't that so? Yes, it is. Therefore, if in the endless time that has gone by, there has been some necessity for those who are on the peaks of philosophy to take charge of a city, or there even now is such a necessity in some barbaric place somewhere far outside of our range of vision, or will be later, in this case, we are ready to do battle for the argument that the regime spoken of has been, is, and will be when this muse has become master of a city. For it's not impossible that it come to pass, nor are we speaking of impossibilities. That it's hard, we too agree. That, he said, in my opinion is so. Will you, I said, say that in the opinion of the many, it isn't so? Perhaps, he said. You blessed man, I said, don't make such a severe accusation against the many. They will no doubt have another sort of opinion, if instead of indulging yourself in quarreling with them, you soothe them and do away with the slander against the love of learning by pointing out whom you mean by the philosophers, and by distinguishing, as was just done, their nature and the character of their practice, so the many won't believe you mean those whom they suppose to be philosophers. And if they see it this way, doubtless you'll say that they will take on another sort of opinion, and answer differently. Or do you suppose anyone of an ungrudging and gentle character is harsh with the man who is not harsh, or bears grudges against the man who bears none? I shall anticipate you, and say that I believe that so hard a nature is in a few, but not the multitude. I too, he said, of course, share your supposition. Don't you also share my supposition, that the blame for the many's being harshly disposed toward philosophy is on those men from outside who don't belong and have burst in like drunken revelers, abusing one another and indulging a taste for quarreling, and who always make their arguments about persons, doing what is least seemly in philosophy? Very much so, he said. For presumably, Adeimantus, a man who has his understanding truly turned toward the things that are, has no leisure to look down toward the affairs of human beings, and to be filled with envy and ill will as a result of fighting with them, but rather because he sees and contemplates things that are set in a regular arrangement, and are always in the same condition, things that neither do injustice to one another, nor suffer it at one another's hands, but remain all in order according to reason. He imitates them, and as much as possible, makes himself like them. Or do you suppose there is any way of keeping someone from imitating that which he admires, and therefore keeps company with? It's not possible, he said. Then it's the philosopher, keeping company with the divine and the orderly, who becomes orderly and divine, to the extent that is possible for a human being. But there is much slander abroad. In every way, that's most certain. If some necessity arises, I said, for him to practice putting what he sees there into the dispositions of men, both in private and in public, instead of forming only himself, do you suppose he'll prove to be a bad craftsman of moderation, justice, and vulgar virtue as a whole? Least of all, he said. Now, if the many become aware that what we are saying about this man is true, will they then be harsh with the philosophers, and distrust us when we say that a city could never be happy otherwise than by having its outlines drawn by the painters who use the divine pattern? No, they won't be harsh, he said, provided they do gain this awareness. But what kind of drawing do you mean? They would take the city and the dispositions of human beings as though they were a tablet, I said, which in the first place they would wipe clean. And that's hardly easy. At all events, you know that straight off in this they would differ from the rest, in not being willing to take either private man or city in hand, or to draw laws before they receive it clean, or themselves make it so. And they are right, he said. Next, don't you think they would outline the shape of the regime? Of course. After that, I suppose that in filling out their work they would look away frequently in both directions, toward the just, fair, and moderate, by nature, and everything of the sort, and again toward what is in human beings, and thus, mixing and blending the practices as ingredients, they would produce the image of man, taking hints from exactly that phenomenon in human beings, which Homer too called godlike, and the image of God. Right, he said. And I suppose they would rub out one thing and draw in another again, until they made human dispositions as dear to the gods as they admit of being. The drawing, he said, would at any rate be fairest that way. Are we then somehow persuading those men who you said were coming at us full speed, I said, that the man we were then praising to them is such a painter of regimes? It was on his account that they were so harsh, because we were handing the cities over to him. Are they any gentler on hearing it now? Yes, and very much so, he said, if they are moderate. For how will they be able to dispute it? Will they say the philosophers aren't lovers of that which is and of truth? That would be strange, he said. Or that their nature, as we described it, isn't akin to the best. Not that either. Or this, that such a nature, when it chances on suitable practices, will not be perfectly good and philosophic if any is. Or are those men whom we excluded by nature more so? Surely not. Will they still be angry when we say that before the philosophic class becomes master of a city, there will be no rest from ills either for city or citizens, nor will the regime about which we tell tales in speech get its completion in deed? Perhaps less, he said. If you please, I said, let's not say that they are less angry, but that they have become in every way gentle, and have been persuaded so that from shame, if nothing else, they will agree. Most certainly, he said. Now let's assume they have been persuaded of this, I said. And as to the next point, will anyone argue that there is no chance that children of kings, or of men who hold power, could be born philosophers by their very natures? There won't, he said, even be one who will argue that. And if such men came into being, can anyone say that it's quite necessary that they be corrupted? That it's hard to save them, we too admit, but that in all of time not one of all of them could ever be saved. Is there anyone who would argue that? How could he? But surely, I said, The birth of one, if he has an obedient city, is sufficient for perfecting everything that is now doubted. Yes, he said, one is sufficient. For, of course, when a ruler sets down the laws and practices that we have gone through, I said, it's surely not impossible that the citizens be willing to carry them out. Not at all. But, then, is it anything wonderful or impossible if others also have the same opinions as we do? I don't suppose so, he said. And further, that it is best, granted it's possible, we have, I believe, already gone through sufficiently. Yes, it was sufficient. Now, then, as it seems, it turns out for us that what we are saying about law-giving is best if it could come to be, and that it is hard for it to come to be. Not, however, impossible. Yes, he said, that's the way it turns out. Now that this discussion has after considerable effort reached an end, mustn't we next speak about what remains? In what way, and as a result of what studies and practices, the saviors will take their place within our regime for us, and at what ages each will take up each study? Indeed we must, he said. It hasn't, I said, turned out to have been very wise of me to have left aside previously the unpleasantness about the possession of women, nor to have left aside procreation, as well as the institution of the rulers either. I did so because I knew that the wholly and completely true institution is a thing both likely to arouse resentment and hard to bring into being. But, as it was, the necessity of going through these things none the less arose. Well, what particularly concerns women and children has been completed. But what concerns the rulers must be pursued, as it were, from the beginning. We were saying, if you remember, that they must show themselves to be lovers of the city, tested in pleasures and pains, and that they must show that they don't cast out this conviction in labors or fears, or any other reverse. The man who's unable to be so must be rejected, while the one who emerges, altogether pure, like gold tested in fire, must be set up as ruler and be given gifts and prizes, both when he is alive and after he has died. These were the kinds of things that were being said as the argument, covering his face, sneaked by, for fear of setting in motion what now confronts us. What you say is quite true, he said. I do remember. My friend, I shrank from saying what has now been dared anyhow, I said. And let's now dare to say this. Philosophers must be established as the most precise guardians. Yes, let it be said, he said. Then bear in mind that you'll probably have but a few. For the parts of the nature that we described as a necessary condition for them are rarely willing to grow together in the same place. Rather, its many parts grow forcibly separated from each other. How do you mean, he said. You know that natures that are good at learning, have memories, are shrewd and quick and everything else that goes along with these qualities, and are as well full of youthful fire and magnificence. Such natures don't willingly grow together with understandings that choose orderly lives, which are quiet and steady. Rather, the men who possess them are carried away by their quickness, wherever chance leads, and all steadiness goes out from them. What you say is true, he said. And, on the other hand, those steady, not easily changeable dispositions, which one would be inclined to count on as trustworthy, and which in war are hard to move in the face of fears, act the same way in the face of studies. They are hard to move and hard to teach, as if they had become numb, and they are filled with sleep and yawning when they must work through anything of the sort. That's so, he said. But we are saying that this nature must participate in both in good and fair fashion, or it mustn't be given a share in the most precise education, in honor, or in rule. Right, he said. Don't you suppose this will be rare? Of course. Then it must be tested in the labors, fears, and pleasures we mentioned then. And, moreover, what we passed over then but mention now, it must also be given gymnastic in many studies to see whether it will be able to bear the greatest studies, or whether it will turn out to be a coward, as some turn out to be cowards in the other things. Well, that's surely the proper way to investigate it, he said. But exactly what kinds of studies do you mean by the greatest? You, of course, remember, I said, that by separating out 3 forms in the soul, we figured out what justice, moderation, courage, and wisdom each is. If I don't remember, he said, it would be just for me not to hear the rest. And also what was said before that? What was it? We were, I believe, saying that in order to get the finest possible look at these things, another and longer road around would be required. And to the man who took it, they would become evident, but that proofs on a level with what had been said up to then could be tacked on. And you all said that that would suffice. And so, you see, the statements made at that time were, as it looks to me, deficient in precision. If they were satisfactory to you, only you can tell. They were satisfactory to me within measure, he said. And it looks as though they were for the others, too. My friend, I said, a measure in such things, which in any way falls short of that which is no measure at all. For nothing incomplete is the measure of anything. But certain men are sometimes of the opinion that this question has already been adequately disposed of, and that there is no need to seek further. Easy-goingness, he said, causes quite a throng of men to have this experience. Well, I said, it's an experience a guardian of a city and of laws hardly needs. That's likely, he said. Well then, my comrade, I said, such a man must go the longer way around, and labor no less at study than at gymnastic. Or else, as we were just saying, he'll never come to the end of the greatest and most fitting study. So these aren't the greatest, he said, but there is something yet greater than justice and the other things we went through. There is both something greater, I said, and also even for these very virtues it won't do to look at a sketch, as we did a while ago. But their most perfect elaboration must not be stinted. Or isn't it ridiculous to make every effort so that other things of little worth be as precise and pure as can be, while not deeming the greatest things worth the greatest precision? That's a very worthy thought, he said. However, as to what you mean by the greatest study and what it concerns, do you think anyone is going to let you go without asking what it is? Certainly not, I said. Just ask. At all events, it's not a few times already that you have heard it. But now you are either not thinking or have it in mind to get hold of me again and cause me trouble. I suppose it's rather the latter, since you have many times heard that the idea of the good is the greatest study, and that it's by availing oneself of it along with just things, and the rest that they become useful and beneficial. And now you know pretty certainly that I'm going to say this, and besides this, that we don't have sufficient knowledge of it. And if we don't know it, and should have ever so much knowledge of the rest without this, you know that it's no profit to us, just as there would be none in possessing something in the absence of the good. Or do you suppose it's of any advantage to possess everything except what's good, or to be prudent about everything else in the absence of the good, while being prudent about nothing fine and good? No, by Zeus, he said, I don't. And further, you also know that in the opinion of the many, the good is pleasure, while in that of the more refined, it is prudence. Of course. And, my friend, that those who believe this can't point out what kind of prudence it is, but are finally compelled to say about the good. And it's quite ridiculous of them, he said. Of course it is, I said, if they reproach us for not knowing the good and then speak as though we did know. For they say it is prudence about the good, as though we, in turn, grasped what they mean when they utter the name of the good. Very true, he said. And what about those who define pleasure as good? Are they any less full of confusion than the others? Or aren't they too compelled to agree that there are bad pleasures? Indeed, they are. Then I suppose the result is that they agree that the same things are good and bad, isn't it? Of course. Isn't it clear that there are many great disputes about it? Of course. And what about this? Isn't it clear that many men would choose to do, possess, and enjoy the reputation for things that are opined to be just and fair, even if they aren't, While, when it comes to good things, no one is satisfied with what is opined to be so, but each seeks the things that are. And from here on out everyone despises the opinion. Quite so, he said. Now this is what every soul pursues, and for the sake of which it does everything. The soul divines that it is something, but is at a loss about it, and unable to get a sufficient grasp of just what it is, or to have a stable trust such as it has about the rest. And because this is so, the soul loses any profit there might have been in the rest. Will we say that even those best men in the city, into whose hands we put everything, must be thus in the dark about a thing of this kind and importance? Least of all, he said. I suppose, at least, I said, that just and fair things, when it isn't known in what way they are good, won't have gotten themselves a guardian who's worth very much in the man who doesn't know this. I divine that no one will adequately know the just and fair things themselves before this is known. That's a fine divination of yours, he said. Won't our regime be perfectly ordered if such a guardian, one who knows these things, oversees it? Necessarily, he said. But now, Socrates, do you say that the good is knowledge or pleasure, or something else beside these? Here's a real man, I said. It's been pretty transparent all along that other people's opinions about these things wouldn't be enough for you. It doesn't appear just to me, Socrates, he said, to be ready to tell other people's convictions, but not your own, when you have spent so much time occupied with these things. And what about this? I said. Is it your opinion that it's just to speak about what one doesn't know, as though one knew? Not at all as though one knew, he said. However, one ought to be willing to state what one supposes, as one's supposition. What, I said, haven't you noticed that all opinions without knowledge are ugly? The best of them are blind. Or do men who opine something true without intelligence seem to you any different from blind men who travel the right road? No, he said. Do you want to see ugly things, blind and crooked, when it's possible to hear bright and fair ones from others? No, in the name of Zeus, Socrates, said Glaucon. You're not going to withdraw when you are, as it were, at the end. It will satisfy us, even if you go through the good just as you went through justice, moderation, and the rest. It will quite satisfy me too, my comrade, I said. But I fear I'll not be up to it, and in my eagerness I'll cut a graceless figure, and have to pay the penalty by suffering ridicule. But, you blessed men, let's leave aside for the time being what the good itself is, for it looks to me as though it's out of the range of our present thrust to attain the opinions I now hold about it. But I'm willing to tell what looks like a child of the good and most similar to it, if you please, or, if not, to let it go. Do tell, he said. Another time you'll pay us what's due on the Father's narrative. I could wish, I said, that I were able to pay, and you were able to receive it itself, and not just the interest, as is the case now. Anyhow, receive this interest and child of the good itself. But be careful that I don't in some way unwillingly deceive you in rendering the account of the interest fraudulent. We'll be as careful as we possibly can, he said. Just speak. Yes, I said, as soon as I've come to an agreement and reminded you of the things stated here earlier and already often repeated on other occasions. What are they? He said. We both assert that there are, I said, and distinguish in speech many fair things, many good things, and so on for each kind of thing. Yes, so we do. And we also assert that there is a fair itself, a good itself, and so on for all the things that we then set down as many. Now again, we refer them to one idea of each, as though the idea were one, and we address it as that which really is. That's so. And, moreover, we say that the former are seen but not intellected, while the ideas are intellected but not seen. That's entirely certain. With what part of ourselves do we see the things seen? With the sight, he said. Isn't it with hearing, I said, that we hear the things heard, and with the other senses that we sense all that is sensed? Of course. Have you, I said, reflected on how lavish the craftsman of the senses was in the fabrication of the power of seeing and being seen? Not very much, he said. Well, consider it in this way. Is there a need of another class of thing in addition to hearing and sound, in order that the one hear and the other be heard? A third thing in the absence of which the one won't hear and the other won't be heard? No, he said. I suppose, I said, that there are not many other things, not to say none, that need anything of the kind. Or can you tell of any? Not I, he said. Don't you notice that the power of seeing and what's seen do have such a need? How? Surely, when sight is in the eyes, and the man possessing them tries to make use of it, and color is present in what is to be seen, in the absence of a third class of thing whose nature is specifically directed to this very purpose, you know that the sight will see nothing, and the colors will be unseen. What class of thing are you speaking of? He said. It's that which you call light, I said. What you say is true, he said. Then the sense of sight and the power of being seen are yoked together with a yoke that, by the measure of an idea by no means insignificant, is more honorable than the yokes uniting other teams, if light is not without honor. But of course, he said, it's far from being without honor. Which of the gods in heaven can you point to as the Lord responsible for this, whose light makes our sight see in the finest way, and the seen things seen? The very one you and the others would also point to, he said, for it's plain your question refers to the sun. Is sight, then, naturally related to this God in the following way? How? Neither sight itself, nor that in which it comes to be, what we call the eye, is the sun. Surely not. But I suppose it is the most sun-like of the organs of the senses. Yes, by far. Doesn't it get the power it has as a sort of overflow from the sun's treasury? Most certainly. And the sun isn't sight either, is it? But as its cause is seen by sight itself. That's so, he said. Well then, I said, say that the sun is the offspring of the good, I mean. An offspring the good begot in a proportion with itself, as the good is in the intelligible region with respect to intelligence, and what is intellected. So the sun is in the visible region with respect to sight and what is seen. How, he said. Explain it to me still further. You know, I said, that eyes, when one no longer turns them to those things over whose colors the light of day extends, but to those over which the gleams of night extend, are dimmed and appear nearly blind, as though pure sight were not in them. Quite so, he said. But I suppose, when one turns them on those things illuminated by the sun, they see clearly, and sight shows itself to be in these same eyes. Surely. Well, then, think that the soul is also characterized in this way. When it fixes itself on that which is illumined by truth, and that which is, it intellects, knows, and appears to possess intelligence. But when it fixes itself on that which is mixed with darkness, on coming into being and passing away, it opines and is dimmed, changing opinions up and down, and seems at such times not to possess intelligence. Yes, that's the way it seems. Therefore, say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives the power to the one who knows is the idea of the good. And as the cause of the knowledge and truth, you can understand it to be a thing known, but as fair as these two are, knowledge and truth, if you believe that it is something different from them, and still fairer than they, your belief will be right. As for knowledge and truth, just as in the other region it is right to hold light and sight sun-like, but to believe them to be sun is not right. So too here to hold these two to be like the good is right, but to believe that either of them is the good is not right. The condition which characterizes the good must receive still greater honor. You speak of an overwhelming beauty, he said. If it provides knowledge and truth, but is itself beyond them in beauty, You surely don't mean it is pleasure? Hush, Glaucon, I said. But consider its image still further in this way. How? I suppose you'll say the sun not only provides what is seen with the power of being seen, but also with generation, growth, and nourishment, although it itself isn't generation. Of course. Therefore, say that not only being known is present in the things known as a consequence of the good, but also existence and being are in them besides as a result of it, although the good isn't being but is still beyond being, exceeding it in dignity and power. And Glaucon quite ridiculously said, Apollo, what a demonic excess! You, I said, are responsible for compelling me to tell my opinions about it. And don't under any conditions stop, he said, at least until you have gone through the likeness with the sun, if you are leaving anything out. But, of course, I said, I am leaving out a throng of things. Well, he said, don't leave even the slightest thing aside. I suppose I will leave out quite a bit, I said. But all the same, insofar as it's possible at present, I'll not leave anything out willingly. Don't, he said. Well then, I said, conceive that, as we say, these two things are, and that the one is king of the intelligible class and region, while the other is king of the visible. I don't say of the heaven, so as not to seem to you to be playing the sophist with the name. Now, do you have these two forms, visible and intelligible? I do. Then take a line cut in two unequal segments, one for the class that is seen, the other for the class that is intellected, and go on and cut each segment in the same ratio. Now, in terms of relative clarity and obscurity, you'll have one segment in the visible part for images. I mean by images first shadows, then appearances produced in water and in all close-grained, smooth, bright things, and everything of the sort, if you understand. I do understand. Then in the other segment, put that of which this first is the likeness, the animals around us, and everything that grows, and the whole class of artifacts. I put them there, he said. And would you also be willing, I said, to say that with respect to truth or lack of it, as the opinable is distinguished from the knowable, so the likeness is distinguished from that of which it is the likeness? I would indeed, he said. Now, in its turn, consider also how the intelligible section should be cut. How? Like this. In one part of it a soul, using as images the things that were previously imitated, is compelled to investigate on the basis of hypotheses, and makes its way not to a beginning but to an end, while in the other part it makes its way to a beginning that is free from hypotheses. Starting out from hypothesis and without the images used in the other part, by means of forms themselves, it makes its inquiry through them. I don't, he said, sufficiently understand what you mean here. Let's try again, I said. You'll understand more easily after this introduction. I suppose you know that the men who work in geometry, calculation, and the like, treat as known the odd and the even, the figures, three forms of angles, and other things akin to these in each kind of inquiry. These things they make hypotheses, and don't think it worthwhile to give any further account of them to themselves or others, as though they were clear to all. Beginning from them, they go ahead with their exposition of what remains, and end consistently at the object toward which their investigation was directed. Most certainly I know that, he said. Don't you also know that they use visible forms besides, and make their arguments about them, not thinking about them, but about those others that they are like? They make the arguments for the sake of the square itself, and the diagonal itself, not for the sake of the diagonal they draw, and likewise with the rest. These things themselves that they mold and draw, of which there are shadows and images in water, they now use as images, seeking to see those things themselves, that one can see in no other way than with thought. What you say is true, he said. Well then, this is the form I said was intelligible. However, A soul in investigating it is compelled to use hypotheses, and does not go to a beginning because it is unable to step out above the hypotheses. And it uses as images those very things of which images are made by the things below, and in comparison with which they are opined to be clear and are given honor. I understand, he said, that you mean what falls under geometry and its kindred arts. Well, then go on to understand that by the other segment of the intelligible, I mean that which argument itself grasps with the power of dialectic, making the hypotheses not beginnings but really hypotheses, that is, stepping stones and springboards, in order to reach what is free from hypothesis at the beginning of the whole. When it has grasped this, argument now depends on that which depends on this beginning, and in such fashion goes back down again to an end, making no use of anything sensed in any way, but using forms themselves, going through forms to forms. It ends in forms too. I understand, he said, although not adequately, for in my opinion, it's an enormous task you speak of, that you wish to distinguish that part of what is and is intelligible contemplated by the knowledge of dialectic as being clearer than that part contemplated by what are called the arts. The beginnings in the arts are hypotheses, and although those who behold their objects are compelled to do so with the thought and not the senses, these men, because they don't consider them by going up to a beginning, but rather on the basis of hypotheses, these men, in my opinion, don't possess intelligence with respect to the objects, even though they are, given a beginning, intelligible. And you seem to me to call the habit of geometers and their likes thought and not intelligence, indicating that thought is something between opinion and intelligence. You have made a most adequate exposition, I said. And along with me, take these four affections arising in the soul in relation to the four segments. Intellection in relation to the highest one, and thought in relation to the second, to the third assign trust, and to the last imagination. Arrange them in a proportion, and believe that as the segments to which they correspond participate in truth, so they participate in clarity. I understand, he said, and I agree, and arrange them as you say.